I also want to thank the Schusterman Foundation because 10 years ago, I started working with a couple organizations just on a volunteer basis and realized that there was a real need. At that point, it was building websites. And we applied for a grant through STAR, Synagogue's Transformation and Renewal at that time, and they had a challenge grant program, and with funds from the Schusterman Foundation, we kicked this off. So I appreciate their visionary leadership then as well as now. And it's been really fun collaborating with them and others, both on the New Media Fund and also on this today. So thank you for being here. It's so exciting for me to have this many people in the room. I've been hammering to get people to engage in this conversation for so long, and I feel like it's a very ripe moment. So what I want to do today is just introduce sort of the new rules of the game. Some of these may be obvious to you, some of them may not, but I think when Adam was speaking about this not just being how to do better on my Facebook page, it's actually more of an organizational issue. These are the rules and the language and the conversations that I think we need to be having. And I think we need to be having them not alone as the one person who gets it and is interested and is sitting in the room today, but having these conversations within our organizations with both staff and lay leadership and as a community as well. This is the printing press, right? This is a different communications revolution at a different time, a different context, a different piece of technology. What happened when the printing press was invented? Scribes were out of a job, unless you're writing Torah scrolls. What else?
Revolution?
What kind of revolution?
Information became more accessible.
Information was more accessible.
People were more empowered because they had books and were able to read.
People were empowered with knowledge, yeah.
People were terrified.
Terrified of what?
New technology, what it meant, how to change things.
Great.
Loss of control.
Loss of control, interesting. So many more people can now have their ideas expressed in the written word and disseminated.
It was a totally new economy developed.
New economy, great. People became literate. That's sort of the take-home message of the printing press story that often isn't told. That prior to the printing press, when books were handwritten, there were very few in number and they were very expensive, and only the elite and the wealthy had access to that written material. Therefore, there were tons of people who weren't literate, right? Once information is available in a written form, widely accessible and cheap, now you bother to learn how to read. That's big, right? Once you learn how to read, you go to school, and once you go to school, you become educated, and when you're educated, you participate in civic society in a new and different sort of way. So for a couple hundred years after the invention of the printing press, we see political, economic, social, and religious revolution powered by, really, at the heart of it, the fact that people became literate, okay? So with that idea that this isn't about using a piece of technology, it's about fundamental shift in society. Today we're talking about what it means to be online, on your phone, digital, mobile, a different sort of information and communication revolution. And when we think about this, and you'll notice that I did not put up a picture of an iPhone or an iPad or a processor or some widget or gadget. This is actually about people and about relationships. So I want us to frame our thinking today in that. We are the Jewish community. We are about people. We are about values. We are about mission. The technology is simply the tools to do that effectively and well in today's world. So let's not get hung up in the actual technology. What I want to do today is just name 10 rules of the game, right? I could have picked 5, I could have picked 20, I picked 10. And these are the language that I'd like you to be able to take home today. First of all, we're working in an attention economy. So when Adam was talking before about people underestimating the cost of building a website or hiring staff, right? That's a numbers economy. When we calculate risk, we often calculate that based on the number of dollars that we're investing, right? But actually we're working in an attention economy, and if you can't get the attention of the people that you're trying to engage, you're not going to be able to achieve your goals and your mission regardless of how you're measuring it. So we need to be thinking about what are all of the attributes necessary in order to earn people's attention and their trust and keep it over a period of time. Because while we might be having little sound bites in 140 characters, that's not the ultimate goal. Right? The goal is about information, identity, relationships, whatever your mission may be and what we think are Jewish communal values and needs. But that's not about dollars necessarily, although dollars are important to make all of that happen. So one, we're working in an attention economy. Two is about authenticity. So paramount to getting and keeping people's attention is being a real person and being authentic and having shared values and shared interests. If we're measuring our success by the number of tushes in the seats, and all I'm trying to do as a professional is coerce you into being in the seat so that I can say I was successful, that's not authentic. And the hallmark of the younger generations today is that they can sniff inauthenticity like in an instant. It's like, you know, a trained dog in the airport looking for drugs, okay? So your task is how to figure out how to be authentic, right, yourself, but also how to communicate authentically. Shel Israel, who's the author of a book on blogging, and also one from a year, maybe 2 years ago, called Twitterville, about the use of Twitter in business, although I think it's also very applicable to nonprofits as well, talks a lot about branded logo tweeting. And while we may want to be tweeting under the name and umbrella of our organizations for lots of reasons, and many of us are actually doing that from here today, myself included, how you make that more personal and more authentic is important. And how you make it more casual so that you don't feel like highly edited glossy text, but you actually feel like a real person who loves what they do and is really trying to make a difference in the world and help the people in your community achieve their goals and our shared goals, not just the institution's goals. And I think Adam's example of the minion to say Kaddish is a great example of that. Our third rule is about listening and engaging. So when we're working in a landscape about relationships and new ways of communicating in 2 ways, and maybe even in 3 and 4 dimensions as well, asynchronous communications, for example, or across time and space, we need to be listening first and talking second. So many organizations jump into social media and they get their Facebook page or their Twitter account or whatever it may be, and they think this is a great free tool to be broadcasting our message and talking at you, right? Here's our event, come this time, we have a capital campaign, whatever it may be. But actually the most important thing you can do is listen. And I know a number of the people in the room today are really great listeners online, and that helps you build relationships. There's a number of people in this room that I have maybe never met or met once or twice. We see each other once a year, maybe once every other year, but actually we've got pretty strong relationships and we help each other out and watch each other's back and support each other all the time because we listen to each other and we engage with one another. We don't talk at each other. And that's also very different, not only as an individual skill, but as an institutional culture. And I think a lot of what we're talking about in the Jewish community, this exists elsewhere, but I think it's particularly important for the Jewish community, is about culture change. And we have a very defined culture and we're very ingrained in that culture, and it's hard to shift that culture. I think the Jewish New Media Innovation Fund actually was a very important marker for culture shift because it was an incentive for so many individuals and institutions to start having conversations about shifting that culture and not just putting it off because it's hard or difficult or inconvenient. So listen first, engage, don't talk at people. Rule number 4 is about adding value and being generous. Right? Oftentimes as professionals, we're asking something of the people in our networks. Please come to our event. Please give to our campaign. Please make us a priority in your life. And actually, what we need to do is flip the whole conversation. As organizations, we need to be generous. When you're working in an attention economy, we need to be the ones that are helping the people, individuals, families in the Jewish community, helping them solve their own problems. Helping them find the information that they're actively seeking in the ways that they actually want it. Helping the guy who goes to synagogue 2 times a year say Kaddish for his father. He wants to do it. How can we support that? That's a great thing. We should be breaking down every barrier possible, not building them up. Now, how we do that with a business model in reality is another question. But what we need to be doing is shifting our thinking to adding value and being generous. And then the business models, the income streams, the staffing follow from there. When we try and shift what we're doing in the same institutional context, we're just going to run up against a brick wall. So instead of trying to do new things in the same old way, I think we need to be really questioning some of those fundamental assumptions of our culture and the way we do business. Adding value can be a link to an important resource. It can be listening to a question. I had a friend who posted, she's a friend from our synagogue preschool, right? So this is also Adam's example of being sick and listening. She posts on her Facebook status at 11 o'clock at night how she's struggling to explain the death of a family pet to her 2 young kids. This is her parents' dog died. And her 3-year-old and her 5.5-year-old are saying, when do we get to see the dog again? Can we take a spaceship up to heaven to go visit the dog? Like, all these questions, right? There's an issue of developmental appropriateness and understanding, and there's also a theological issue, a spiritual issue, and a parenting issue in that. And our Jewish communal educators are actually wonderful people to be helping support that mother in her moment of need. They can deepen her connection to the Jewish community and how her kids forevermore think about death in a Jewish way. So listening is an opportunity to add that value in a customized and personal way. Number 5 is that it is all about relationships and about networks. And this is where data is really, really valuable. Because not only do you see each individual and the things that they attended, right, because that's not really the way we want to be measuring things. You can see flows and maps and grouping of people, and you can be responsive to your community in a way that without that data and without these sorts of mapping tools and understanding networks wasn't possible before. So I encourage you to think about how you're in the relationship business and thinking about your mission through that lens. And also thinking about how you are capturing data and understanding your networks, how those networks work, how you can use the networks to help you and help them achieve shared mission and goals. Number 6 is transparency. This was a big part of the New Media Innovation Fund, asking the applicants to use open source things, to share what they're doing, to have transparency. People are now asking to see the proposals or see the comments from the judges and the raters and advisory group. Transparency earns you trust. Transparency earns you trust. And when people trust you, they feel like they're in a relationship with you, and when they're in a relationship, you get their attention. So transparency isn't just about taking off the covers and allowing everybody to see everything. It is in service of defining a community and shared values and shared goals and making that happen together as a flatter community, not just top down. So I encourage you to think about what you're transparent about and what you're not, and why. Why do you hide numbers or hide processes? Why is that information that shouldn't be publicly available? What's the risk of making it available? And what actually might be the benefit of sharing that? At Darim, we're thinking about that a lot. This is an example from the Indianapolis Museum of Art. They actually put on their website a dashboard of a number of different metrics that they believe are mission-centric and are their goals. And you'll notice those include memberships, the size of their endowment, the number of works of art, the number of visitors. It also includes kilowatt hours per day, because in a museum, they use a lot of energy to light and heat and control the humidity to preserve the works of art. And one of their goals is to reduce their energy consumption. So these are the different measurements by which they evaluate their success on a number of different fronts. And if you click on any of these boxes, it will give you history of these numbers over time. Okay? Now, if you click on memberships or endowment, you'll see that when the economy took a hit, those numbers plummeted. And our instinct is often, oh gosh, we don't want to show weakness, right? We want to hide those numbers. We only want to show that we're super strong and right? But being transparent about those numbers changed the conversation within their community, changed people's decisions about, actually, I'm going to keep my membership because this is important for this organization, which I believe in, and this is a value of mine. I'm not just a consumer buying a product from this organization. So this is a very interesting example of a certain type of transparency that you might want to go look at and think about how it feels to be looking at that information. In Beth Cantor and Allison Fine's book, The Networked Nonprofit, there's a great case study about this and many presentations online too if you're interested in more depth. Number 7 is new measurements, and I've alluded to this, that when we measure tushes in the seats, that's really only one marker of success and isn't necessarily the most important number that we should be measuring or thinking about. And I think in terms of changing the conversation and changing the way we work, this actually might be the most important thing that you spend time thinking about. And for many of the people in the room, this means going back and talking to executive directors and other senior staff and board members as well, because you may or may not be the person in charge of deciding what are the things you're measuring and how. The measurements, the ways that we define our success drive everything. They drive the way that we raise money, the way that we write grant proposals, the way that we allocate time and staffing, the attitude by which we communicate. And if we are measuring things in an old school way, even if we're trying to evolve our organizations and the ways we work, we will always fall back into those old patterns and habits. It's hard to change from the status quo. And if we're measuring things in the old way, it's just reinforcing that status quo. So I would say if you're looking at trying to have a conversation and evolve and change your organization and the way you work, and as the Jewish community, if we're trying to do that as well, this is the first place we need to look. We do a lot of research, we do a lot of measurement in the Jewish community, we spend a lot of communal dollars working at that. And it's good, I'm not saying that we shouldn't be measuring, we definitely should. But what we're measuring and how we're measuring and what we do with that information, I think is really, really important. Has anybody had this conversation in your work? Are measuring things in new ways? Would you like to share?
Oh, just that it's very difficult.
Yeah, okay. Anyone else? Sasha, do you want to say a word or two?
Sure. I mean, you're right. I think in the Jewish world, a lot of us think of measures for evaluation purposes so that we can show funders as a marketing tool and vehicle to prove our success. I mean, has anyone ever seen a report that didn't show success? But we need to start thinking of measures as a management capacity, something that we use to help determine our actions and our choices on a day-to-day basis.
Yes. Tell us who you are before you speak.
I'm Randy Univer from the Reconstruction Rabbinical College. I think there's also a difficulty when different departments or sectors of an organization are going to new measures and others have not come along yet. And I think your emphasis throughout the talk on sort of a system-wide shift is really important, and we could possibly help each other in how you even out the siloed thinking within our own organizations.
Mm-hmm. Great. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Sarah from Big Yacht. I think one of the big challenges with measurements too, and I'm curious how people have dealt with this, is that what we in this room understand is that conversations are important, and that capturing, that it's difficult to measure the value of a conversation, but conversations have enormous value. And that's a little bit different than measuring outcomes. So, you know, in the fundraising world, we used to talk about it as stewarding or cultivating, but we didn't measure it the same way. Or maybe we measured prospects. But I think that's just a big piece of this that we're not capturing well.
I agree. Yeah.
So somewhat related to that is a lot of the work that we do is related to qualitative changes. And how do you measure? I'm not talking about a family didn't light Shabbos candles and now they do, because that you can measure. But attitudinal changes and changes that happen over a long period of time. So those things are hard, and we don't always have people for long periods of time.
Right. This is Brenda from the Jewish Communal Service Association. I think you just hit on something that's really important that Sarah did as well, which is the new things that we need to be listening to and capturing and measuring aren't necessarily easy to do. And so we often shy away from them. And I think this works at every level, right? It's the people who are capturing that information on the ground. It's the managers who are deciding about time and energy and people allocated to different things. And it's how we communicate that to our donors and our funders as well. So it requires a shift in thinking on all of those levels, and it's not necessarily all just in numbers.
And I think it's I'm Jane Slocum from Pelley. I also think it's the tension between how quick and short and fast everything's moving, but how change might take time.
Yes.
So we wrestle a lot with this idea of what we're measuring might take 5 years, but how we measure methodologies can change quicker. You know what I'm trying to say? It's a real tension between the two.
Yes, I think that's true. I also want to point out that the individuals and the communities that we're measuring don't only exist in our organization. So actually trying to have any controls on measurement is completely and totally pointless. So I think this actually warrants not only organizational conversations, but communal conversations, because we're all in this for the same purposes, even though we might be tackling different issues from different angles. Any last thoughts about measurement? Okay. Number 8 is about the people, you and me and all the folks who are staffing this. And as we saw in the case of the printing press, that overnight, basically, an entire profession disappeared, right? Those of the scribes. And today we're seeing staffing structures, the capacity of staffs, the way that you have people on staff full-time or you use networks and collaborate with others, what people's job descriptions are. There's a big shift in the nonprofit community from program directors to community facilitators, for example. So what are the job descriptions and how do people allocate their time to do what we do best in this new landscape? One of the things I spend a lot of time talking about is that every time you hire a new person, from an administrative assistant up through a CEO or executive director, this also applies to recruiting new board members. Bring people on who are thinking in these new ways. Because the more of those people that you have in the conversation, the more energy and the more enthusiasm and the more support there will be for the types of things that we're talking about today. So bring that in at every point where you can. And finally, about professional development, whether it's us here today or participating in N10 or webinars, we all need to be constantly learning. The printing press was a few hundred years of change and chaos before things sort of evened out. In this revolution, many experts say it'll be about 50 years until we start to see things plateau, or that we get used to the rate of change, maybe. And that means for the rest of all of our lives and our professional careers, even for the youngest in the room, change is the name of the game. So we need to position ourselves as individuals, as well as our organization, as well as the Jewish community, to be nimble and to be prepared for change, and that means constantly educating ourselves. This example actually comes from Dan, sitting here at the front of the room. I learned about him, about this from him last year when we spoke to a group of Wexner Fellows. And Netflix is a great example of a company that has been nimble and prepared for change. Netflix started by shipping VHS tapes in the mail. And none of us really knew about Netflix because that didn't really work so well. It was big and bulky and cost a lot, right? But then when the game changed to be DVDs, which were really easy to put in your mailbox, really simple to ship, didn't crack and break in the mail nearly as much, Netflix became huge. We changed the ways we were consuming videos, right? Now, it might have taken 2 days for the DVD to arrive in the mail, whereas I could have driven a mile away and gotten it within half an hour at Blockbuster. So actually, we traded instant gratification for convenience and other services. Might seem a little counterintuitive, but it changed the way many of us consume video, right? Now, Netflix also knew that when broadband became ubiquitous, that people were going to be streaming things. Long before you or I had iPads or were sitting in our PJs on the couch or in bed streaming movies on our laptops, Netflix knew this was coming. And they built their business model, including all of the licensing to stream that content, years in advance, so that when we had the iPad and we were sitting on our bed up in a hotel room, there was Glee, like, streaming right at us, and we didn't have to wait 2 days for a DVD to come in the mail, or frankly, for the DVD even to come out, right? So this required thinking about business models, income stream, licensing, staffing in advance of where the individuals in the community were. We have that backwards in the Jewish community. We are constantly playing catch up, trying to understand where the individuals in our community are and how we can claw ourselves to the top to be working with them in the ways that they're living their lives. And more often than not, we're the ones that are saying you need to go out of your way to participate in the Jewish community, and that's driven by guilt and fear. needs to end, because it's not going to work. It's not working now, and it's surely not going to work in the future. And that might be a bitter pill to swallow for many of us, but what I want to encourage you today, and I may be preaching to the converted a little bit, is that we need to leapfrog, right? We cannot afford to make incremental change and constantly be trying to play catch up, because the society at large that we are serving is evolving faster than our community and our organizations are able to evolve. So there's two parts to that. One, we need to make our organizations more nimble to evolve more quickly and figure out what that looks like. And number two is we need to leapfrog over some of that growth curve in order to catch up and position ourselves to continue to evolve with the rest of the community.
I was just wondering if you had any particular examples of that, of either organizations you see doing that well or projects you see doing that well, because I'm just having trouble like thinking.
Sure. Can you tell us who you are?
Sorry, I'm Rebecca Ennin. I'm the development director at United for Justice, which is a local here in DC organization that organizes the Jewish community to take action on local social justice issues.
Great. Does anybody in the room have an example you'd like to share? Okay. We're going to learn from two case studies in our next piece that might speak to that a little bit. I think there are examples of this in the nonprofit community. I think the examples in the Jewish community are a little bit more rare. As Adam mentioned before, I think many of those who are achieving playing at the level that the community is playing now are the new organizations and the startups that were created in this moment. So they don't actually have to go through that change, but they're gaining traction and participation at a credible rate because they're working in that way. Oftentimes with fewer buildings and lighter staff and in a much more streamlined way. So I think this is a question that's really important for our community. Was there a comment back here, Sasha or Adam? No, okay. And if you have examples of that, by the way, feed them back to me, because I'm always curious about learning about those. And our last of the 10 is really about leadership. And what leadership looks like in this age is very different than what leadership has looked like before. That the institutional structures are flattening, the way that we engage with communities is changing, and the ways that our leaders need to be authentic and transparent and community weavers, not just talking at people, is very, very different. And I think we are starting to see a shift in that leadership in the Jewish community, which is really exciting. But something to think about if you are a leader of an organization, how you can be adapting your leadership models. A couple books, if you're interested in reading more about this. The Network Nonprofit is written by Beth Cantor and Allison Fine. Allison's son had a bar mitzvah last weekend, and she's not here this N10, but Beth Cantor is, and I really recommend that you check out some of her sessions. Darim is also hosting a networked nonprofit book club that's happening in a Facebook group, the new Facebook groups. So that's the link right there. You're all welcome to come participate. We're asking questions, having conversations. You can go back and contribute to conversations that were started a couple weeks ago. It will be ongoing. There's about 175 people participating, although you won't be hammered with a ton of content. And Empowered and Open Leadership are written by Josh Burnoff and Charlene Lee. They were the authors of the book called Groundswell that came out a few years ago that was really, I think, a groundbreaking book about how businesses are using social media and technology in new ways. There's definitely a shift across the community. You'll also see that here at N10 from talking about the tools to talking about leading in this sort of age. N10 offered a technology leadership academy. Karen and I participated in that in its last version. There's also one that's happening here live, and they're continuing to do national cohorts of that leadership academy, which I think really reinforces the fact that this conversation isn't just about the techie people or the communications people. This is about leadership, and hopefully that's why you're in the room today. Just to close, I want to give an example that I learned from Clay Shirky. This is an early steamboat. John Fitch was an early inventor of the steam engine, one piece of technology, and he said, gosh, this is going to revolutionize shipping. And so he plunked it in a boat, took out the 12 strong guys, connected it with rods, and ta-da, we have a steamboat. But that's not really how steamboats work, right? This was an example of taking a new piece of technology and plunking it into an old system. That's what many of us are trying to do when we write a grant to build a website or to do better with our Facebook page, both of which are important. But that's not really answering the fundamental question of how do we need to look at our entire system in this age. So it took him years to re-engineer the boat, not the steam engine, but the boat, in order to make the best use of this technology. It didn't mean that the steam engine didn't work. It didn't mean that shipping wasn't a good way to transport people and goods. It meant we had to look at the entire system. So that's the framing that I want you to think about our conversation today, the entire N10 conference, and moving forward. And we'll have just a couple minutes for questions, and then I want you all to have a break. Any thoughts? Work that you're doing?
Can you talk for a second, Lisa, something you've taught me, that you talked a little bit of, like what that process of that organizational change looks like? Like, what does it actually take to do that change?
I think it depends on the organization. In many cases, I really think it needs to be at the board level, which is often neglected. Because while the staff can be doing a lot, if you take something to the board and it's a brick wall, it might be all for naught. So obviously this depends on your organization and it depends on your board. An example from my life, my synagogue, which tends to be a very positive, quite creative place, they did a learning task force, 2-year study to think about education in the congregation. And when I heard about this, I was so excited, right? Here's a deep dive into thinking really creatively, questioning all sorts of assumptions, and redesigning education from the preschool and early childhood center, all the way up through religious school, B'nai Mitzvah training, adult education. And what they came back with was totally obvious and such a wasted opportunity. Partially because they used the people who were on the board and said, sure, I'll be on that task force, right? But those weren't necessarily the right people to be pushing the agenda. In other cases, I see the staff or maybe a task force or subcommittee really pushing the agenda, but when they come back for board approval, the board isn't ready to take those risks because they haven't talked about new ways of measuring, they haven't talked about what sorts of risks they're going to take and how they're going to identify those risks. So I think one of the most important conversations that you can be having is about risk, right? If you imagine scales, for a long time, change has been more risky than the status quo because it might be expensive, it's definitely unknown, and what the status quo is known, it's going okay, even if it's not going great, and it's safer, and that's how all of our systems are set up for. We are now at a tipping point where where not changing is more risky than changing, right? We're at a point where not changing is actually more risky than changing. We're also in an age where we're sort of in the permanent beta. If you're a Gmail user, when you log in, you might have noticed that it's had the word beta up there for a long time. And Gmail actually took down the word beta, not because they're saying, okay, we're done with the beta stage, but because they've acknowledged we are in a permanent beta stage, so we don't actually need to be labeling it anymore. And what that means is things are constantly evolving, right? Constantly. So by collecting data, by listening, constantly refining what you're doing, that's the mode that we're in. So when you think about risk, think about how we can try something out and go through iterations to evolve it constantly, rather than calculating risk, doing a heavy-duty study, creating a prototype, evaluating the prototype, getting funding, building the whole thing. It's now been 5 years later and your original idea is like so old school it's not even worthwhile anymore. So that iterative cycle, I think, is really important, not something that we're used to. I think having that very, very honest conversation about risk at the board level and the senior management level is very important, and how you measure, as I said before, I think is another very important conversation to have.
I'm Deborah Glansford-Craning from the Construction Surveying College, and my question is about how some of these kinds of changes that you're talking about, and I guess in particular, one of the things that came up was the relationship between more established organizations and some of the newer, more nimble organizations that have come up. So mapping that on with change that happens within organizations. on top of the way technology itself tends to map onto a younger cohort, and addressing some generational tensions within the Jewish community, and how you may have seen examples of organizations or communities that have been able to embrace change in ways that don't also aggravate some of those generational tensions, and thoughts that you might have about how we as a larger community can move forward in this way without feeding into a kind of generational culture war.
Any examples in the room?
I think that
Introduce yourself.
Oh, I'm Harley Appleman from the Covenant Foundation. I think that it's not going to take too much longer as the boomers have already taken hold of this and are online and involved in a huge way, and I think that the tension's going to really lower as they get more and more grandchildren, basically. No, it is. It's a conversation with your long-distance grandchildren that are going to influence the board members, and they're going to look for ways to actuate that more and more. And if the young people in this room are smart, they'll have more babies and make this thing happen sooner.
I'll just add to it.
Just a commercial.
Arlene Pro Baby. Good to know. I think there's a fallacy that we often in the Jewish community fall into. That my organization represents one community, and it's in a box, and you're in it or you're out of it. And when that's the model in which you think about your constituency, then how do I bring the people together to make one? Well, and in reality, our communities they're never been that thick-lined, and today the line is thinner and thinner and thinner, and to which it doesn't exist at all. So a community is actually made up of lots of sub-communities, and those sub-communities have relationships with each other, and they actually have relationships with people outside, right? So my closest friend may not belong to my synagogue. So that doesn't mean that my closest friend doesn't have thoughts, opinions, and might actually participate in my synagogue's official programmatic experiences. So I think part of what are the joys of Judaism, like one of the beautiful things about Judaism is that I can be Jewish, somebody else can be Jewish, we can look completely different, and we still say that we're Jewish at the end of the day. That diversity of Jewish thought and idea is one of the reasons that we actually can do this. Because if somebody who they want to get together with their 10 friends and have lox and bagels in the morning, and that's how they express being Jewish, and that's it, fine, they can do that, and that's okay. Because my experience is going to be very different than yours, and we can still say we're part of the same broader community. So I actually would challenge us to make it so that question is irrelevant. That's the goal that I think we should be striving for, because there's so many different little sub-communities that we can all have different rules of the game, and that's okay. And the technology allows us to affiliate with those small subsets in a much more powerful way than we could before.
Right. I think that's great. For the sake of time, I just want to add a couple closing comments, and then we're going to take a break. One is, in the network nonprofit, there's a great conversation about core and periphery, which I think gets at exactly what Adam was just talking about, and a new way of thinking about the definitions of our communities. So that's one place to look to think about that. The other is that we have multiple communities within our organizations, and that's always going to be the case. The classic example I give with synagogues is that I have people tell me all the time, like, oh, we don't have any time for the social media stuff. We can't listen on Facebook or Twitter because we don't have any time. But they're spending 45 hours a month and $25,000 a year printing and producing a print newsletter that half the people don't read, and the ones who read cover to cover don't do anything differently, show up more, give more, whatever, because of that. So that's a place where we need to go back and question our assumptions in the status quo. Now, what you may hear from older members is, I'm not on Facebook, I want my print newsletter. But I think what we need to be talking about is a relationship and a emotional feeling of being connected and part of something, not that those 24 pages of paper actually are everything to me. So just another point about questioning assumptions.